is Asher Lev. Chapter 1. My name is Asher Lev, the Asher Lev, about whom you have read in newspapers and magazines, about whom you talk so much at your dinner affairs and cocktail parties, the notorious and legendary Lev of the Brooklyn crucifixion. I am an observant Jew. Yes, of course, observant Jews do not paint crucifixions. As a matter of fact, observant Jews do not paint at all, in the way that I am painting. So strong words are being written and spoken about me, myths are being generated. I am a traitor, an apostate, a self-hater, an inflictor of shame upon my family, my friends, my people. Also, I am a mocker of ideas sacred to Christians, a blasphemous manipulator of modes and forms revered by Gentiles for 2,000 years. Well, I am none of these things, and yet, in all honesty, I confess that my accusers are not altogether wrong. I am indeed, in some way, all of those things. The fact is that gossip, rumors, myth-making, and news stories are not appropriate vehicles for the communication of nuances of truth, those subtle tonalities that are often the truly crucial elements in a causal chain. So it is time for the defense, for a long session in demythology. But I will not apologize. It is absurd to apologize for a mystery. And that is what it has been all along, a mystery, of the sort theologians have in mind when they talk about concepts like wonder and awe. Certainly it began as a mystery, for nowhere in my family background was there any indication that I might have come into the world with a unique and disquieting gift. My father was able to trace his family line down through the centuries to the time of the Black Death in 1347, which destroyed about half the population of Europe. My father's great-great-grandfather was in his early years the manager of vast estates of carousing Russian noblemen who when drunk, sometimes killed serfs. Once, in an act of wild drunkenness, he burned down a village and people died. You see how a goy behaves. I would be told by my father and mother. The people of the Sitra Atra behave this way. They are evil and from the other side. Jews do not behave in this way. My father's great-great-grandfather had transformed those estates into a source of immense wealth for his employer as well as himself. In his middle years, he began to travel. Why did he travel so much, I would ask? To do good deeds and bring the master of the universe into the world, my father would respond. To find people in need, and to comfort and help them, my mother would say. I was told about him so often during my very early years that he began to appear quite frequently in my dreams, a man of mythic dimensions, tall, dark-bearded, powerful of mind and body, a brilliant entrepreneur, a beneficent supporter of academies of learning, a legendary traveler, and author of the Hebrew work, Journeys to Distant Lands. That great man would come to me in my dreams and echo my father's queries about the latest bare wall I had decorated, and the sacred margins I had that day filled with drawings. It was no joy waking up after a dream about that man. He left a taste of thunder in my mouth. My father's father, the man whose name I bear, was a scholar and a recluse in his early and middle years, a dweller in the study halls of synagogues and academies. He was never described to me, but I pictured him as slight of body and huge of head, with eyelids swollen from lack of sleep, face pale, lips dry, the veins showing blue along his cheeks and temples. In his youth he earned the name Ilui, genius, a term not lightly bestowed by the Jews of Eastern Europe, and by the time he was 20 he had come to be known as the genius of Moser, after the Russian town in which he lived. Shortly before his 50th birthday, he abruptly and mysteriously left Moser and, with his wife and children, journeyed to Ladov and became a member of the Russian Hasidic sect led by the Rebbe of Ladov. He began to travel throughout the Soviet Union as an emissary of the Rebbe. Why did he travel so much? I once asked. To bring the Master of the Universe into the world, my father replied. To find people who needed help, my mother said. While on his way home from the Rebbe synagogue late one Saturday night, he was killed by a drunken, axe-wielding peasant. Somehow my grandfather had forgotten it was the night before Easter. My mother came from a family of leading Sadegger Hasidism, something Jews who had been followers of the great Eastern European Hasidic dynasty established by Israel of Rizin. On her father's side, my mother could trace her family back to the Rebbe of Berdichev, one of the saintliest of Hasidic leaders. On her mother's side, the family line consisted of great scholars, down to the Chmielewski massacres in 17th century Poland, where it vanished in blood and death. So little Asher Lev, born in 1943 to Rivke and Aryeh Lev in the section of Brooklyn known as Crown Heights, little Asher Lev was the juncture point of two significant family lines, the apex, as it were, of the triangle seminal with Jewish potentiality and frightened with Jewish responsibility. But he was also born with a gift. I have no recollection of when I began to use that gift, but I can remember at the age of 4 holding my pencil in the firm first grip of a child and transferring the world around me to pieces of paper, margins of books, bare expanses of a wall. I remember drawing the contours of that world, my narrow room with the bed, the paint-it-yourself bureau and desk and chair, the window overlooking the cemented backyard, our apartment with its white walls and rug-covered floors, and the large framed picture of the Rebbe near the living room window, the wide street that was Brooklyn Parkway, 8 lanes of traffic, the red brick and white stone of the apartment houses, the neat cement squares of the sidewalks, the occasional potholes in the asphalt, the people of the street, bearded men, old women gossiping on the benches beneath the trees, little boys in skullcaps and side curls, young wives in long-sleeved dresses and fancy wigs. All the married women of our group concealed their natural hair beneath wigs for reasons of modesty. I grew up encrusted with lead and spectrumed with crayons. My dearest companions were Eberhard and Crayola. Washing for meals was a cosmic enterprise. I remember drawing my mother, born and raised in Crown Heights, her family high in the ranks of the Ladover aristocracy. She had gone through the Ladover school system for girls and had married my father 1 week after graduation from high school. She was 19 when I was born and seemed more a sister to me than a mother. I remember my first drawings of my mother's face, long and straight nose, clear brown eyes, high boned cheeks. She was small and slight, her arms were thin and smooth-skinned, her fingers long and thin and delicately boned. Her face was smooth and smelled of soap. I loved her face next to mine when she listened to me recite the Kriya Shema before I closed my eyes to go to sleep. I remember those early years of my life, those first years of my efforts with pens and pencils and crayons. They were very happy years. Laughter came easily both to me and my mother. We played, we took long walks. She was a gentle big sister. I drew her walking with me along Brooklyn Parkway, her coat collar up around her chin, her cheeks flushed in a high autumn wind, 2 roundish spots of bright pink against the smooth fair skin of her face. In the winter, I drew her tossing snowballs at trees that lined the wide parkway, her arm motions like those of a little girl. Often we ran through the drifts together, kicking up the snow with our galoshes, and I drew that too. "Oh, how pretty," she said to me once, looking at a drawing of herself jumping over a snowbank. "Oh, I like this one, Asher. You made the snow very pretty, and so high. What a jump. Did I jump like that? I'm almost flying." In the spring, we sometimes went rowing in Prospect Park, not far from where we lived. She was an awkward rower, and she would laugh nervously whenever she fell backward off her seat from a skimming pull at the oars. But we went anyway, and often I took my crayons and pad with me and drew her as she rowed, and drew, too, the look of the water beneath the sky and the surface movements stirred up by her erratic oars. "Asher, it isn't nice to draw your mamma like this." "But it was the time you fell in the boat, Mamma. It isn't nice, it isn't respectful. But the shore is very pretty. How did you do that?" "I used sand from the beach, Mamma. Can you see the sand?" And in the summer, I drew her light long-sleeved blouses with the tiny beads of perspiration on her upper lip and brow. Her dresses and blouses were always long-sleeved, for out of modesty the women of our group never wore short-sleeved garments, and she perspired a great deal in the heat, especially on our walks together. "What is that on my face?" she asked, looking at one of my summer drawings in us walking through the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. "Those are the spots, Mamma." "What spots, Asher?" "The wet spots, Mamma. When it's hot, when there are wet spots." After a moment she said, "But why didn't you draw the pretty birds, Asher? And the flowers, Asher? Why didn't you draw the flowers?" In the very early years, before my mother became ill, my father traveled a great deal. I asked him once during breakfast, Is my papa going away again today?" "To Ottawa," he said, not looking up from his New York Times. "Where is Ottawa?" "Ottawa is a very important city in Canada." He spoke with a faint Russian accent. "Canada is a country next to America," my mother explained. "Why is my papa going to Ottawa?" "To meet people in the government," my mother said proudly. "Why?" My father looked up from the newspaper. "The Reb asked me to go." He had been brought to America at the age of 14, together with his mother and older brother, and had been 25 when I was born. He was a graduate of Ladover Yeshiva in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. He had earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Brooklyn College and a master's degree in the same subject from New York University. He had earned those degrees at the request of the Reb. He was tall and thick-shouldered. His eyes were sharp, direct, and dark. His untrimmed beard was red, as was the hair on his head. He kept his side curls tucked behind his ears. It was from him that I inherited my red hair and dark eyes. My slight features and thinness of build I inherited from my mother. I came into the kitchen one morning and found him preparing the orange juice. He had his own way of making our orange juice. Each of us received the juice of one orange, half a glass of cold water, and a teaspoonful of sugar. It was a refreshing drink to wake up to every morning. Sometimes I was able to determine from the way he prepared the orange juice whether or not he would be traveling that day. He was in a hurry that morning, so I knew he would be traveling. I knew he would be traveling. "Good morning," I said. "Is my papa traveling again today for the Reb?" "Good morning, Asher. Did you say Modeh Ani?" "Yes, Papa. Sit down. I'll make you your orange juice." I sat down. My mother was putting dry cereal on the table. "Your papa is going to Washington today," my mother said. "What is Washington?" "The city where the government of America is." My papa is traveling to Washington for the Reb? Yes, my mother said. She took great pride in my father's missions for the Reb. Why does my papa travel for the Reb? My father poured orange juice into my glass. My father traveled for the Reb's father. May they both rest in peace. I travel for the Reb. It is a great honor to be able to travel for the Reb. What does my papa do when he travels for the Reb? So many questions, my father said. Drink your juice, Asher. The vitamins will go away if you let it stay too long. Sometimes he left after supper. Most of the time, he left after breakfast. My mother and I would go with him to the door. Have a safe journey, my mother would say, and she would add in Yiddish, go in health and return in health. They would not embrace. They never embraced in my presence. My father would kiss me, take his black leather bag and his attaché case, and leave. Sometimes I would go to the living room window and see him come out of our apartment house and hail a cab, or watch him walk toward the building that was the international headquarters of the Let Over movement, a block and a half away. I would watch him walking quickly beneath the trees along Brooklyn Parkway, the black leather bag and attaché case in his hands, a copy of the New York Times under his arm, a tall, broad-shouldered, red-headed, neatly dressed man in a dark suit and coat and narrow-brimmed hat, walking with the faintest of limps from the polio he had been stricken with as a child in Soviet Russia. I drew him often during those very early years. I drew him as he sat evenings with my mother, reading or talking. I drew him drinking coffee with my mother at the kitchen table. Sometimes I would wake in the night and hear them in the kitchen. Often they sat at that table late into the night, drinking coffee and talking, and I would lie in my bed, wondering what they were saying. I drew my memory of my father and me walking together to our synagogue. He was so tall and I was so short, and he would incline his head toward me as we walked. I drew him as he prayed at home in his prayer shawl and tefillin on those weekday mornings when for some reason he could not go to the synagogue. He would stand at our living room window, his head covered with the prayer shawl, swaying faintly back and forth, with only the edge of his red beard protruding from the white-black striped shawl. I drew my memory of him praying in our synagogue on the Shabbos, garbed in his prayer shawl, only his red beard visible. I drew my memory of him weeping in Yom Kippur as he chanted the prayer describing the slaughter of the 10 great sages by the Romans. I would stand close to him in the white sanctity beneath the prayer shawl, and I would see him cry as if the killing were taking place before his eyes. I drew my memory of him carrying the palm frond and citron on the festival of Sukkos, the small lemon-like fruit dwarfed by his large hand. I drew my memory of him lighting our Hanukkah candles on the sill of our living room window. He would chant the blessings and light the candles, and my mother and I would join him in the songs. Then he would stand a long time at the window and watch the tiny flames burning against the huge night. Often on Shabbos or festivals, I would see him in the living room, studying Talmud or a book on Hasidus. Sometimes I would find him looking at the passage in the tractate Sanhedrin. Any man who has caused a single Jewish soul to perish, the Torah considers it as if he had caused a whole world to perish. And any man who has saved a Jewish soul, it is as if he had saved the whole world. I asked him once, is it only if he kills a Jewish person, Papa? No, Asher. Elsewhere the same passage appears without the word Jewish. Papa, how can a man who kills one person be like one who kills a whole world? Because he also kills all the children and children's children who might have come from that person. Why do you study that so often, Papa? He smiled faintly, and his eyes grew dreamy. My father liked to study it often, Asher, and I drew my memory of my father studying that tractate of the Talmud. He said to me once, gazing at one of my drawings, "You have nothing better to do with your time, Asher? Your grandfather would not have liked you to waste so much time with foolishness." "It's a drawing, Papa. I see what it is." "A drawing is not foolishness, Papa." He looked at me in surprise, but he said nothing. I was almost 5 at the time. He was indifferent to my drawing. He thought it's some he thought he thought it something children did when they were very young and then outgrew. But I continued to draw him anyway, though after a while I stopped showing him the drawings. I drew my memory of him singing Zemeros during our Shabbos meals. My mother and I would sing to him. He had a deep voice, but he sang softly, his eyes closed, his head thrown slightly back, so that I could see the white skin of his neck below the start of the thick growth of red beard. I drew my memory of the first time he sang his father's melody to Yo Ribbon Olam during the Shabbos meal of 4 days after the death of his mother, a haunting tune that carried with it pain and suffering and faith and hope. Yo Ribbon Olam, Viomeo, he sang, his eyes closed, his voice soft and quavering, the upper part of his body swaying faintly back and forth between the back of his chair and the edge of our dining room table. Antu Malka Melesh Malshayo. He paused, swaying. He let the pause linger tremulously, then continued, Ovad Gefertiash. Tears flowed from his closed eyes. My mother looked down at the table. I stared at him. I felt my mother's hand on mine. That melody echoed inside my head for days. Again and again, I drew my memory of my father singing his father's melody. He sang it again the week my mother was taken to the hospital. I have only vague memories of the darkness and fog of that week. It was January. I had just turned 6. There was a phone call. My father rushed from the apartment and returned a while later, the blood driven from his face. Then my mother began to scream. The phone rang endlessly, the apartment filled with relatives and friends. My mother continued screaming. People moved about aimlessly, their faces filled with horror and shock. I was in my room, peering out of the door, which I had opened to a tiny crack. I watched the faces of the people and listened to my mother's screams. A cold, uncontrollable trembling took possession of me. Something had happened to my mother. I could not endure the screams. They cut, like the silver of glass that had once opened my hand, like the curb of the sidewalk that had once gashed my knee. The screams cut and cut. People were becoming frenzied and hysterical. I heard loud weeping. Then suddenly the noise died. My mother stopped screaming. There were whispers. I peered into the hallway. 2 tall, dark-bearded men came along the hallway. Behind them walked a man of medium height, wearing a dark coat over a dark suit. He had a short dark beard and wore an ordinary dark hat. He walked in the path cleared by the tall, dark-bearded men. People murmured softly as he passed. His presence seemed to fill the apartment with white light. It was the Reb. Behind the Reb walked 2 more tall, dark-bearded men. The Reb was in my house. I was certain my mother was dead. I lay down on the floor of my room and wept. Later, someone remembered me. I was taken to a neighbor's apartment. The next day, I was brought back. My mother was not dead. She lay in her bed, but I could not see her. Uncle Yakov had been in an accident, my father explained, a car accident in Detroit while traveling for the Reb. My Uncle Yakov was my mother's only brother. He had been to our apartment only 3 days before. He would visit us all the time. He lived alone 2 blocks away. He was short and slight and dark-haired, with brown eyes and thin lips. He looked like my mother. He was studying history and Russian affairs. He was to be an advisor for the Reb. His favorite expression was, "What's new in the world?" He spoke in a soft voice and was gentle. Now he was dead of a car accident at the age of 27. The following day, my mother was taken to the hospital. That Shabbos, my father sang his father's melody to Yo Ribbon Olam. We were in his older brother's home a few blocks away from us, for his sister-in-law would not hear of us having Shabbos in our apartment without my mother. We sat at the table that Friday night, and there were long silences and feeble attempts at Zimaros by my father's brother. And then suddenly my father began to sing his father's melody. There was an unearthly quality to the way he sang that melody that night, as if he were winging through unknown worlds in search of sources of strength beyond himself. His eyes were open, fixed, but gazing inward. There was a sweetness and sadness, a sense of pain and yearning in his voice, soft, tremulous, climbing and falling and climbing again. And when he was done, there was a long silence, and in that silence, I thought I heard distant cries, and I was afraid. Late that night, I came slowly awake from dream-filled sleep, and heard the melody again, and thought I was still dreaming. But even when I knew I was truly awake, the melody still went on. It was my father's voice coming from our living room. I saw him standing in the front window. The huge Venetian blind had been pulled up. It stood rigidly perpendicular to the 2 tall rectangles that were the window's frames. A single small light glowed faintly in the baseboard socket near the window, the light we left on in that room all through Shabbos. It cast weak shadows across the floor and a soft reddish glow on my father's face. He stood looking through the window at the street outside, quietly singing his father's melody. He wore his dark red dressing gown over his pajamas. A tall skull cap covered his head. His side curls hung uncombed alongside his cheeks. The room was dark, save for the single weak nightlight. I stood in the doorway behind him and saw his face reflected in the window. I saw his eyes and watched his lips move. He held his hands to both sides of his head, standing there with the room in shadows and his faintly illumined features reflected in the window that looked out into the dark street. He seemed to spread himself slowly across the wide night, to embrace and cover the darkness with his blanket of melody and soft light. My mother returned from the hospital, and my father stopped traveling. The Reb's staff had suffered a number of casualties since its reorganization in America after the Second World War. One of its members had a heart attack while on a mission in West Germany. A second had been in a serious car accident in Rome. A third was badly beaten one night in Bucharest. There had been others, but my mother's brother was the first to die. There had been a special kind of relationship between my mother and her brother, and his death almost destroyed her. She had always been thin. She returned from the hospital skeletal. At first, I did not know who she was. I thought there had been an error, that somehow they had sent back the wrong person. For the first few days, she remained in her bed. Then she came out and moved spectre-like around the apartment in her nightgown, her eyes dark dead pools, her short dark hair uncombed and uncovered by a wig. She would not speak to anyone. I thought she had lost her voice until I heard her talking in the living room late one afternoon and found she was talking to herself. You had to go, she was saying. Yes? Why did you have to go? How will I cross the street? I felt cold listening to her. I said to my father that night as he was putting me to bed, is my mama going to die? He drew in breath sharply. No, Asher, no. Your mama is not going to die. Is my mama very sick? Yes. Will my mama get better? Yes, with God's help. I want my mama to get better. I want to make pretty drawings for her. My father hugged me to him. I felt his beard on my face. Now go to bed, Asher, and let me hear your Kriya Shema. She wept easily. She tired easily. She cared nothing for the apartment, for food, for the things a person must do to stay alive. A woman came into the apartment every day to clean and cook. Her name was Miss Shindle Rackover. She was a widow with married children, short, plump, stern, energetic, and fiercely pious. She spoke only Yiddish. My mother avoided her. My mother avoided friends and relatives. She avoided me. She avoided my father. She seemed to cringe in the presence of another person. One day, sitting alone in our living room, she began to sing. It was a Hasidic melody, but I did not recognize it. She was imitating a soft voice. Why does my mama sing that way? I asked my father that night. What way? In Uncle Yaakov's voice. He was helping me put on my pajamas. His hands trembled. Your mother is remembering her brother. May he rest in peace. Papa, you remember Uncle Yaakov? Yes. Why don't you sing like that, Papa? He turned his head away for a moment. Then he said, It's time for sleep now. Let me hear your Kriya Shema. I found her alone in the living room one afternoon, about a week after she came back from the hospital. I said to her, Mama, are you feeling better? She gazed at me, but did not seem to see me. Then I saw a flicker of light in her eyes. Asher? Mama? Asher, are you drawing pretty things? Are you drawing sweet, pretty things? I was not drawing pretty things. I was drawing twisted shapes, swirling forms, in blacks and reds and grays. I did not respond. Asher, are you drawing birds and flowers and pretty things? I can draw you birds and flowers, Mama. You should draw pretty things, Asher. Shall I draw you a bird, Mama? You should make the world pretty, Asher. Make it sweet and pretty. It's nice to live in a pretty world. I'll draw you some pretty flowers and birds, Mama. I'll draw them for you right now. Never mind, she said sharply. She looked out the window. It's not complete. Can it make a difference? Tell me how. And the dead look returned to her eyes. She seemed to hate the kitchen and would flee from it as soon as she was done eating. She never came into my room. She either lay in her bed, sleeping or staring at the ceiling, or she sat on the sofa in the living room, gazing out the window at the street below. She began to smoke. She sat in the living room, wreathed in smoke, the ashtrays on the end table beside her spilling over. Mrs. Rackover muttered to herself as she cleaned the ashtrays, but she said nothing to my mother. I began to find stubs of gray ash on the floor of the apartment. About 2 weeks after my mother returned from the hospital, I came into my parents' bedroom late in the morning and found her in bed. It was a large double bed. She lay beneath the green quilt, looking shrunken. Her face was sallow. Her bony hands protruded from the sleeves of her nightgown. She had seemed dead when I came in, but now her eyelids fluttered open, and she raised her head from the pillow and looked at me. She started to speak, stopped, and lay back on the pillow. She gazed up at the ceiling for a moment, then closed her eyes. Her closed eyes looked like ashen knobs in the blue-gray darkness of their sockets. I stood there for a long time. She seemed to be barely breathing. There was a strange, fetid odor in the air. I had come to show her a drawing I had made earlier that morning. It was a drawing of two birds. One of the birds was in a nest. The other was settling into the nest, its wings wide and fluttering. The nest was pale yellow. The birds were orange and deep blue, and there were green leaves and red flowers everywhere. There was a pale blue sky and white clouds and birds often off in the distance. The bird in the nest had large round black eyes. I stood alongside the bed, and watched my mother's slow breathing. "Mama," I said. Her eyes fluttered faintly but remained closed. "Mama," I said again. Her hands moved then, and she turned her head toward me and opened her eyes. I held up the drawing. She gazed at it blankly. "Here are the birds and flowers, Mama." She blinked her eyes. "I made the world pretty, Mama." She turned her head away and closed her eyes. "Mama, aren't you well now?" She did not move. "But I made the world pretty, Mama." Still, she did not move. "I'll make more birds and flowers for you, Mama." Behind me, someone came quickly into the room. I felt a hand on my shoulder. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Rackover whispered fiercely in Yiddish. "I made a drawing for my Mama. I'm making my Mama well." "Come away from here." Her fleshy face quivered. She seemed frightened my mother would wake. "My Mama asked me to make a drawing." "Come away," I said. She turned me forcefully around. I felt her pushing me out of the room. "What kind of boy disturbs a sick mother? I'm surprised at you. A good boy does not do such a thing." She sent me to my room. I sat on my bed, and stared at the drawing. Then I was frightened in the dark and trembling way I had never known before. I went to my desk. A long time afterward, Mrs. Rackover called me to lunch. I found myself in front of a drawing filled with black and red swirls and gray eyes and dead birds. Relatives and friends came to visit my mother. Often, my mother would refuse to see them. Sometimes she would let my father persuade her to join a group of visitors in the living room. She would sit in one of the easy chairs, looking small and fragile, and say nothing. There would be awkward silence, feeble attempts at conversation, and more silences. In those moments, my mother seemed a ghostly spectator, hollow, without a core to her being. Her older sister, a short, robust woman in her early 30s, came in one day from Boston, where she lived with her husband and 4 children. She sat with my mother in our living room. "Rivka, you have a husband and a son. How can you neglect them? You have a responsibility." My father was in the room at the time. There were other relatives there too, but I do not remember who they were. "Look at the boy," my mother's sister said. "Look at him. He's dirty. How can you let him be so dirty?" "Asher is always dirty," my father said. Even after he's bathed, he's dirty. He should not be left alone. How can you leave a little boy alone? He is not left alone. A boy left with a housekeeper all day is alone. A boy without children to play with is alone. My father said nothing. You should send him to your kindergarten. Asher doesn't want to go to the kindergarten. Then he should come and live with me, my mother's sister said. We have a big house. There are 4 children. A boy Asher's age should not be by himself all the time. Asher likes being by himself. It isn't healthy. It leaves scars. You don't want to leave scars on the boy. Let him live with me. There was a brief pause. I felt myself shivering inside. Let me think about it, my father said. My mother had been staring blankly at her sister and saying nothing. It's wrong, Rivke, her sister said. The boy will have scars. Then she said, Rivke, it is forbidden to mourn in this way. My mother was very still. Rivke, the Torah forbids it. My mother sighed. Her frail body seemed to shrink even more in the large chair. Papa and Mama would have forbidden it, her sister said. My mother said nothing. Rivke, her sister said. He was my brother too. A dark light flickered in my mother's sunken eyes. The Torah forbids it, she said quietly. It is forbidden, yes? Yes, her sister said. But there are scars everywhere, my mother said. And who will hold my pennies? She stared out the window at the afternoon sunlight on the trees below. Who will tell me about the fox and the fish? Yaakov, you had to go? You left it unfinished. Who said you had to go? Then she lapsed into silence and would say nothing more. Her sister stared at her open-mouthed. Then she turned her head away and shuddered. That night, alone in my room, I drew my Aunt Leah. I drew her in the shape of a fish being eaten by a fox. What did the doctor say? I asked my father the next evening as he was helping me out of my clothes. To have patience. Will my mama get well? Yes. When? It will take a long time. Will you send me to live with Tante Leah? No, we'll think of something else. Now let me hear your Kriya Shemet, Asher. The weeks passed. The visitors ceased coming. In the first week of March, my father began to take me with him to his office. He worked at a desk in the Ladover headquarters, building a block and a half from where we lived. The building was a 3-story house of tawny stone, with Gothic windows and a flagstone front porch with a white stone railing. It contained offices, meeting rooms, a room with about a dozen mimeograph machines, 2 suites of rooms for the editorial offices of the various Ladover publications, and a small press in the basement. Men came and went all day long. They sat behind desks, met in conference rooms, rushed along corridors, talked frenetically, sometimes quietly, sometimes in loud voices. All the men were bearded and wore dark skull caps and dark suits with white shirts and dark ties. No women worked inside that building. Secretarial work was done by men. On the second floor of the house, in the apartment facing the parkway, lived the Rev and his wife. To the left of the entrance hall, beyond the carved wooden doors that led into the house, was a carpeted wooden staircase. There was endless 2-way traffic up and down that staircase, men with and without beards, young men and old men who were obliviously poor, and men who were clearly affluent, men who were Jews and men who, it seemed to me, were not, and an occasional woman. Twice during those weeks, I saw a tall, gray-haired man in a black hair climb the stairs and turned into the second floor hallway. I noticed his hands. They were huge, rough, and calloused. I wanted to climb those stairs too, but my father had told me never to go beyond the first floor of the building. I would wander through the first floor of the building alone, trying not to get in anyone's way. People knew I was Aryelev's son. They patted my head, pinched my cheek, smiled, nodded indulgently at my drawings, and took my pad and crayons with me every day, and fed me cookies and milk. My father's office was the third along the corridor to the right of the entrance hall. It was a small office, with white walls, a dark brown linoleum floor on the floor, and a window that looked out onto the parkway. There were filing cabinets along the wall opposite the desk. The walls were bare, except for the large framed photograph of the Reb that hung near the window. My father's desk was old and scarred, and seemed a relic of ancient academies of learning. It was cluttered with piles of paper and copies of Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times. Often he sat tipped dangerously back in his swivel chair, his feet on the desk, his small velvet skull cap pushed forward across his red hair onto his forehead. He would sit reading a newspaper or a magazine, and I would worry that he would fall over backward, but he never did. There were 2 telephones on the desk. Frequently, he would talk into one or the other of them and write as he talked. Sometimes one of the men from another office would come in and sit on the edge of the desk and speak quietly with my father. I heard the word Russia often in those conversations. My father spoke English, Yiddish, or Hebrew into the phones. But the second week I was in his office, I heard him use a language I did not recognize. On our way back to the apartment for lunch, I asked him what language it had been. That was French, Asher, he said. Never heard my papa speak French before. I use it when I need it, Asher. I don't need it around the house. Does Mama speak French? No, Asher. Did you learn French in Europe, Papa? I learned it in America. The Reb asked me to study it. Didn't the Frenchman on the phone know Yiddish, Papa? The Frenchman on the phone wasn't a Jew. What did my papa speak to him about? You are full of questions today, Asher. Now I have a question. Your papa also has questions sometimes. Here's my question. Do you think Mrs. Rackover made chocolate pudding for dessert? You wanted chocolate pudding. Mrs. Rackover had not made chocolate pudding. Even when my father used the languages I understood, it was often not clear to me what he was saying. Calls seemed to come to him from all over the country. He would listen and write. He would talk into the phone about train and boat schedules, about this person flying here and that person sailing there, about one community in New Jersey that did not have enough prayer books, another community in Boston that needed school books, a third community in Chicago whose building had been vandalized. At the end of the day, behind that desk, he would be tired and a dark look would fill his eyes. I'm not made for this, he would say. I need people. I hate sitting with telephones. He would walk home with me in brooding silence. One day, he spent almost an entire morning on the telephone arranging to move 2 let-over families from somewhere in France to the United States. Why are they moving, Papa? I asked him on the way home to lunch. To be near the Reb. What is the State Department, Papa? He told me. Why did you talk to that man in the State Department? He's the man who is helping the families to come to America. How is he helping? Asher, you've asked enough questions. Now it's my turn. Are you ready? Do you think Mrs. Rackover finally made chocolate pudding for dessert? Mrs. Rackover had indeed made chocolate pudding for dessert. My absence from the apartment had begun to mellow her. Late one afternoon, toward the end of March, I sat in my father's office, drawing the trees I could see through his window. One of the telephones rang. My father put down his pen, picked up the receiver, and listened for a moment. I looked at his face and stopped drawing. Lines of anger were forming around his eyes and along his forehead. Two sharp furrows appeared above the bridge of his nose between his eyes. His lips became rigid. He gripped the phone so tightly I could see the knuckles of his hand go white. He listened for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice of cold rage. He used a language I had never heard before. He spoke briefly, listened again for a length of time, spoke again briefly, then hung up. He sat at the desk for a moment, staring at the phone. He wrote something on a piece of paper, read over what he had written, made some corrections, then picked up the paper and went quickly from the office. I sat there alone. One of the telephones rang. Then the second phone rang. The first one stopped ringing. The second continued. The ringing sounded suddenly piercing and thunderous inside that little office. I went out and spent the rest of the day on the flagstone porch drawing the street. On the way home, I asked my father what language he had spoken. When? When you were angry, Papa. Russian, he said. You were very angry, Papa. Yes. Did the man hurt you? No, Asher. He was telling me what some people are doing to hurt others. They're hurting Jews, Papa? Yes. We were walking together along the street. The parkway was clogged with late afternoon traffic. There are lots of goyim in the world, Papa. Yes, he said. I've noticed. That evening, my mother refused to join us for supper. I heard my father through the closed door of their bedroom, pleading with her. Rivka, please eat with us. We asked you to eat with us. You can't go on like this, Rivka. She would not move from the bed. We ate in heavy silence without her, served by Mrs. Rackover. Later that night, I was awakened by the sound of my father's voice. I went on bare feet along the hallway and looked into the living room. He was standing in front of the window, chanting softly from the book of Psalms. The next day there were more phone calls in Russian. My father was tense and restless. Between calls, he sat staring morosely at the top of his desk. He went to the window and stood gazing out at the busy parkway. He paced the floor. He seemed caged. He saw me looking at him. I'm not made for desks, Asher. He rubbed the side of his face. I should be there, not here. How can I spend my life talking on the telephone? Who can sit like this all day? I like to sit, Papa. He gave me a dark, brooding look. Yes, he said. I know you like to sit. I held up the drawing I had made that morning of my father behind his desk talking into a telephone. I showed him with an angry face. It showed him with an angry face. It was before, when you were talking Russian, Papa. He looked at the drawing. He looked at it a long time. Then he looked at me. Then he sat down behind the desk. One of the phones rang. He picked it up, listened for a moment, then began talking in Yiddish. I went out and spent the rest of the day on the porch drawing the trees and the cars and the old women on the benches along the street. My mother joined us for supper that evening. She smoked cigarette after cigarette. She had put on one of her blonde wigs, but it was awry and gave her head a grotesque, elongated look. My father tried talking to her, but she would not respond. Finally, he gave it up. We ate in silence. The cigarette smoke formed an acrid cloud around our heads. Mrs. Rackover moved about quietly. From time to time, I heard her sigh. Toward the end of the meal, I said abruptly, "I made a drawing today, Mama." My thin voice sounded loud in the smoky silence of the kitchen. My father had been sitting tiredly over his food. Now he looked at me, startled. "Yes," my mother said in a dead voice. "Yes. Was it a pretty drawing?" "It was a drawing of my papa on the telephone." "On the telephone," my mother echoed. She looked dully at my father. "Asher," my father said quietly, "it was a good drawing, Mama." "Was it a pretty drawing, Asher?" "No, Mama, but it was a good drawing." Her eyes narrowed. They seemed tiny slits in the blue-gray darkness of her sockets. "I don't want to make pretty drawings, Mama." She lit another cigarette. Her hands trembled faintly. An odor rose from her fetid cloying. I put down my fork and stopped eating. My father took a deep breath. Mrs. Rackover stood very still near the sink. "Yes," my mother said. Her voice was sharp. "I want the pennies now, Yakov." "Rivka," my father said, "please." "You should make the world pretty, Asher," my mother whispered, leaning toward me. I could smell her breath. "I don't like the world, Mama. It's not pretty. I won't draw it pretty." I felt my father's fingers on my arm. He was hurting me. "Yes," my mother said, "yes." She stubbed out the cigarette she had just lit and began to light another. Her hands trembled visibly. "No, no, Asher, no, no. You must not dislike God's world, even if it is unfinished." "I hate the world," I said. "Stop it," my father said. "You must not hate it. You must not hate it," my mother whispered. "You must try to finish." "Mama, when will you get well?" "Asher," someone said. "Mama, when I want you to get well. Asher." To this day, I have no idea what happened then. There was a sensation of something tearing wide apart inside me, and a steep quivering climb out of myself. I felt myself suddenly another person. I heard that other person screaming, shrieking, beating his fists against the top of the table. "I can't stand it, I can't stand it, I can't stand it." The other person kept screaming. I remember nothing after that. Sometime later, I woke in my room. My father stood over my bed, looking exhausted. "Mama," I said, "your mama is asleep." "Mama, please." "Go back to sleep, Asher. It's the middle of the night." I was in pajamas. The night light was on near my desk. The slit of window not covered by the shade was black. "No one likes my drawings," I said through the fog of half-sleep. "My drawings don't help." My father said nothing. "I don't like to feel this way, Papa." Gently, my father put his hand on my cheek. "It's not a pretty world, Papa." "I've noticed," my father said softly. My father's brother came over to our apartment some time before Passover. He was about 5 years older than my father, short, somewhat portly, with a round, dark-bearded face, watery brown eyes, and full, moist lips that collected spittle at the corners when he spoke. He operated a successful jewelry and watch repair store on Kingston Avenue, a few blocks from where we lived. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters, and lived in a 2-story brownstone on President Street. We sat in the living room. The window was partly open. The Venetian blind swayed faintly in the breeze that blew into the room. My father's brother wanted us to join his family in his home for the Passover Sederim. My father thanked him, but would not accept. "Why? Rivka cannot leave the apartment. We'll have the Sederim here." "Alone?" "Yes." My uncle squinted his watery eyes. "Listen," he said, "I don't want to mix into your affairs, but I'm your brother, and if a brother can't mix, who can? Have you talked to the Reb? No, you should talk to the Reb. My father looked at his hands and said nothing. Don't look away from me like that. Listen to me. I know how you feel about such things. But when our father had trouble, he went to the Reb's father. I remember. You were only a baby, but I remember. It's not time to go to the Reb. What does the doctor say? The doctor doesn't say anything anymore. Then it's time. Believe me, it's time. What are you waiting for? People go to the Reb because they have a cold. I'm not such people. Listen to me. You should talk to the Reb. The Reb has 1,000 problems. Then one more can't hurt. Listen to an older brother. Talk to the Reb. At that point, my father asked me to leave. I went to my room, sat at my desk, and drew pictures of my uncle. I made him very round and dark-bearded. I gave him a kind of smile and warm eyes. He always wore dark blue suits, but I made his suit light blue because I did not feel dark blue to me, because he did not feel dark blue to me. I was working on the third picture of my uncle when my father came into my room. They stood behind me. My uncle peered over my shoulder at the drawings. This is a 6-year-old boy, he said softly. My father said nothing. A little Chagall, my uncle said. I felt more than saw my father make a motion with his hands and head. I fix watches and sell jewelry, my uncle said, but I have eyes. Who is Chagall? I asked. A great artist, my uncle said. Is he the greatest artist in the world? He is the greatest Jewish artist in the world. Who is the greatest artist? My uncle thought a moment. Picasso, he said. Picasso, I said, tasting the name. Picasso. Is Picasso American? Picasso is Spanish, but he lives in France. What does Picasso look like? I asked. My uncle pursed his lips and squinted his eyes. He is short and bald and has dark burning eyes. How do you know about such things? My father asked. I read. A watchmaker does not necessarily have to be an ignoramus. It's late, my father said to me. Get into your pajamas, Asher. I'll come back to put you to sleep. A regular Chagall, my uncle said. I turned in my chair and looked up at him. No, I said. My name is Asher Lev. The two of them stared at me for a moment. My father's mouth dropped open a little. My uncle laughed softly. This is 6 years old, he said. Good night, Asher. Then he said, I want to buy one of these drawings. Will you sell it to me for this? He took a coin from his pocket and showed it to me. He picked up one of the drawings and put the coin in its place. Now I own an early love, he said, with a smile. I did not understand what he was saying. I looked at my father. His face was dark. Good night, Asher, my uncle said. They went out of the room. The coin gleamed in the light of the lamp on my desk. I could not understand what had happened. I found myself suddenly missing the drawing and afraid to touch the coin. I wanted the drawing back. My father came into the room. He held the drawing in his hand. Without a word, he put it on the desk and took the coin. He was angry. Your uncle Yitzchak has a strange sense of humor, he said, and went from my room. I looked at the drawing. I felt happy to have it back, but I felt unhappy my uncle had not kept it. It was a strange feeling. I could not understand it. My father returned to the room. I asked you to get into pajamas, he said. I began to undress. He sat on my bed watching me. He did not offer to help. Is my papa angry? I asked when I came back from the bathroom. Your papa's tired, he said. Then he said, Asher, would you like to go to Uncle Yitzchak for the Sidorim? Will you and Mama be with me? Your Mama can't leave the house. I want to be with you and Mama. He sighed softly and was silent a moment. Then he shook his head. "Master of the universe," he said in Yiddish, "what are you doing?" The weather turned warm. Green buds appeared on the trees. The sun shone into the living room through the huge window. The rug and white walls and furniture shimmered with light. The light seemed to have a life of its own. On Shabbos and Sunday afternoons, when my father did not go to his office, I stayed in the living room and watched the sunlight. I watched the colors change. I watched new shapes come alive and die in the slow movement of color and light. Sometimes my eyes would hurt after a day of watching. My mother began to sit in the living room in the sunlight. She sat on the sofa near the window, her eyes closed, sunlight bathing her face. She rarely moved. Once she sat down on the sofa, her skin was shallow, translucent. She seemed drained of substance, dry skin and brittle bones surrounding empty space. One Sunday afternoon, I brought my pencil and pad into the living room and drew my mother sitting on the sofa. I drew the sagging curve of her shoulders and back, the concave depression of her chest, the bony stalks of her arms crossed on her lap, the tilt of her head resting against a shoulder with the sun full on her eyes. She did not appear to be bothered by the sun. It was as if there was nothing behind her eyes for the sun to bother. I was having trouble with her face. The cheek on the left side of her face dropped sharply into a concave plane from the high ridge of bone. I could not do the shading with the pencil. There were graduations of darkness in the shade which the pencil could not capture. I tried it once and it did not work. I used the eraser. Then I tried it again and used the eraser again. And now the drawing was smudged. Some of the line had been weakened. I put it away and on a new piece of paper once again drew the outer contour of my mother's body and the inner contour of her arms. I felt the face blank for a while. I left the face blank for a while, then filled in the eyes and nose and mouth. I did not want to use the pencil again. The drawing felt incomplete. It bothered me to have it incomplete. I closed my eyes and looked at the drawing inside myself. Went over its contours inside myself, and it was incomplete. I opened my eyes. Along the periphery of my vision, I saw an ashtray on the table next to the sofa. It was filled with my mother's smoked-out cigarettes. I looked at the crushed dark ends of the cigarettes. Quietly, I went to the ashtray and brought it to my chair. I put it on the floor. Then, holding the pad with the drawing on my lap, I carefully brushed the burnt end of the cigarette onto my mother's face. The ash left an ugly smudge. I rubbed the smudge with my pinky. It spread smoothly, leaving a gray film. I used the ash from another cigarette. The gray film deepened. I worked a long time. I used cigarette ash on the part of her shoulder, not in the sunlight, and on the folds of her housecoat. The contours of her body began to come alive. I was working on the shadows in the sockets of her eyes when I realized that my father was in the room watching me. I had no idea how long he had been standing in the doorway. I thought he had been there a long time. He was not looking at me, but at the drawing. He could see the drawing clearly from where he stood. There was fascination and perplexity in his face. He seemed awed and angry and confused and dejected, all at the same time. I thought he would be angry at me for drawing my mother while she rested. Instead, he simply turned and went quietly from the room. I heard him walk up the hallway and go into his bedroom. I put the ashtray back on the table near the sofa, collected my pad and pencil, and went to my room. That night, as my father helped me out of my clothes, he said quietly, "I wish you wouldn't spend all your time playing with pencils and crayons, Asher. It isn't playing, Papa. It's drawing. I wish you wouldn't spend all your time drawing, my father said. Is my papa angry with me for drawing my mama this afternoon? No, he said wearily. No, I was careful not to wake my mama. I saw Mama didn't wake up. Who showed you to use cigarettes that way? I thought of it by myself. Once I used sand in a drawing, and I thought of it by myself too. It was when I was rowing with Mama. My father was silent for a long moment. He seemed very tired. Did I give you your vitamins today, Asher? Yes, Papa. He turned off the light. Let me hear your Kriya Shema. I recited the Kriya Shema. He kissed me and started slowly from the room. Papa? Yes, Asher. I'm sorry for drawing Mama and making you angry at me. He started to say something, then stopped. I wanted to draw the light and the dark. I said. Yes, he said softly. Go to sleep, Asher. He went from the room. I'll have to draw it again, I thought. Maybe there is something else besides cigarettes I can use. It's too hard to work with cigarettes, and they smell. There must be something else. I fell asleep. I dreamed of my father's great-great-grandfather. He was dozing in the sunlight in the living room, and I was drawing him when he woke. He went into a rage. He stormed about the room. He was huge. He towered over me. His dark beard cast huge swaying shadows across the rug. Wasting time, he thundered. Playing, drawing, wasting time. I woke in terror, my heart beating loudly. I lay in bed and could not sleep. I went to the bathroom and urinated. On the way to my room, I saw a dim light in the living room. I looked in. My father stood near the window, swaying back and forth. I went silently back to my bed. I would find something other than cigarettes. I would put all the world into light and shade, bringing life to all the wide and tired world. It did not seem an impossible thing to do. The stores that were run by observant Jews were all closed on Shabbos and open on Sunday. I went with my father early one Sunday morning to the grocery store. It was a cool, sunny spring morning. There was little traffic on the parkway. Sunday morning was the only time the parkway rested. The store was long and narrow and old. Cans and bottles stood on dusty shelves along the walls. Boxes and cartons were stacked in disarray on the floor. Now the store was jammed with kosher for Passover foods. Cartons of matzos teetered on both sides of the narrow aisle that led from the door to the counter. The counter was piled with paper bags, bills, boxes of candy. Behind the counter stood a man I had never seen before. He was short and thin, with large bulging eyes, a beak-like nose, and pinched, wrinkled features. A dark stubble covered his face. He wore a dirty white apron, an old brown wool sweater, and a strange-looking cap. His eyes had a nervous look. He kept glancing over his shoulders as he went along the narrow aisle between the cartons of matzos. He nodded his head vigorously at my father and wiped his hands on the apron. He said something in a language I did not understand and held out a hand across the counter. They shook hands. My father said something to him, and he looked down at me and smiled. His teeth were stained and misshapen. He leaned across the counter and extended his arm. We shook hands. His fingers and palms were dry and thickly calloused. Asher, my father said, say hello to Reb Udal Krinsky. Hello, I said. Good morning, said the man in heavily accented English. A nice morning. He had a hoarse, raspy voice. Reb Krinsky just arrived from Russia, my father said. I stopped eyeing the boxes of candy on the counter and looked at the little man. I told my son you just arrived from Russia, my father said in Yiddish to the man. Thursday, the man said to me in Yiddish and smiled again. How are you feeling? My father asked him. How should you feel? The man peered down at me. What is your name? Asher? Did you know, Asher, that your father is an angel of God? He turned to my father. How should you feel? There we went through the 7 gates of Matsos. Here I stand in Matsos over my head. So how should a Jew feel? You are an angel of God, and the Reb, he should live and be well. The Reb made miracles and wonders for me. At night, I tell myself it is a dream, and I am afraid to wake up. If it is a dream, better I should not wake up. Better I should die in my sleep. You should not talk this way, my father said quietly. Reb Lev, no man in the whole world should talk this way, but it is the way I feel. They were silent for a moment. Then my father said, Here are the things I need, and handed the man a slip of paper. Yes, the man said, right away. He scurried about for a few minutes. He was putting it all into a paper bag when my father said, still in Yiddish, You learn the store quickly. I have learned more difficult things than the store even more quickly, the man said. To survive, you learn to learn quickly. He handed the bag to my father. I wish you a kosher and happy Pesach, and I wish your wife a complete recovery. Outside, I asked my father, Is that man one of those you helped bring from Russia? Yes, Asher. How many came? 3. Is he the owner of the store now? No, Asher. He's working there during these weeks before Pesach. We'll find other work for him later. Is he one of us? Yes, Asher, he is one of us. Why does he wear that hat? He wore that hat in Russia. The Reb told him to continue wearing it here. It's called a casquette. Why did the Reb tell him to wear it in America? So everyone would see a Russian Jew who remained a Jew. Is the leader of Russia bad to the Jews, Papa? Stalin? He said quickly in Hebrew. May his name and memory be erased, he went on bitterly in English. Stalin is from the Sitra Atra. I said to Mrs. Rackover when we came into the apartment, we saw a Jew from Russia. Yes, she said, the man in the store, is he well? He looks very skinny, I said. 11 years in Siberia, she said. It is miracles and wonders he is alive. Reb Lev, your wife is asking for you. My father hurried off to the bedroom. What is Siberia? I asked. What is Siberia? Mrs. Rackover echoed. It is a land like the inside of this refrigerator. She was putting away the milk we had bought. It is a land of ice and darkness where the Russian government sends people it hates. Go wash your hands, and I will give you a glass of milk and some cookies. What is Siberia? No one should know of it. The Reb's father sat 3 years in Siberia. I had 2 cousins in Siberia. One died, the other returned, but could not remember his own name. Go wash your hands, Asher. I went down to the hallway to the bathroom and stood on the wooden stool. I was short and needed the stool to reach the faucets. In the mirror over the sink, I was red-haired and had dark eyes, short and red-haired with dark eyes. Dark burning eyes, I thought. I splashed water on my clothes and on the floor. Dark burning eyes. How do I draw a land of ice and darkness? How would Picasso draw a land of ice and darkness? I dried my hands and came out of the bathroom. My father was in the kitchen. Mrs. Rackover was putting a cup of coffee and a roll on a tray. My father took the tray and went with it into the bedroom. How is my mama? I asked. Your mama asked to eat something, Mrs. Rackover said. It is a good sign. Did you wash your hands? I held up my hands for her to inspect. You washed your shirt and your pants too. Sit down. I'll give you milk and cookies. A few minutes later, my father brought the tray back into the kitchen. The cup was empty and the roll was gone. My mama is better? I asked. I don't know, my father said wearily. Maybe a little better. Can I see my mama? Later, my father said, "Now your mamma is resting." He picked up the newspaper, which he had left on the kitchen counter. "You have something to do with yourself, Asher?" "Yes, Papa. First you will finish your milk and cookies," Mrs. Rackover said. My father went from the kitchen. I sat at the table, looking down into the milk in my glass. Ice is white, I thought. White like milk. No, not white like milk. There is blue in ice, and gray. "Asher, drink your milk," I heard Mrs. Rackover say. "What color is the feeling cold?" I asked. Mrs. Rackover stopped drying the cup in her hands and peered at me closely. "Ah," she said. "The feeling cold," I heard myself say, "and the feeling dark. Asher, finish and go to your room. You will make me crazy with your nonsense. Finish and go." Ice is the color blue and gray and white, I thought. Then I thought, no, it isn't blue and gray and white. I don't know what color it is. It bothers me not to know that. I felt upset, and there was no sense of irritation inside me. Ice is what color? I fidgeted on the chair. "Finish," Mrs. Rackover said. I drank the milk and ate the last of the cookies. "Thank God," Mrs. Rackover said, removing the glass and the dish. "My mamma is really feeling a little better?" "I am not a doctor, and I am not the master of the universe," Mrs. Rackover said. "I do not know. Go play in your room. Wash your hands and face first. You have as much milk and cookies outside you as you have inside you. Ah, how a 6-year-old boy eats. Go, go, go." Inside my room, I lay on my bed with my eyes closed and thought about the man from Russia. I saw his face clearly, the nervous eyes, the beaked nose, the pinched features. That face had lived 11 years in a land of ice and darkness. I could not imagine what it was like to live in ice and darkness. I put my hands over my eyes. There was his face, very clearly, not truly his face, but the way I felt about his face. I drew his face inside my head. I went to my desk, and on a piece of blank white paper, drew how I felt about his face. I drew the casquette. I did not use any colors. The face stared up at me from the paper. I went back to the bed and lay on it with my eyes closed. Now there was ice and darkness inside me. I could feel the cold darkness moving slowly inside me. I could feel our darkness. It seemed to me then that we were brothers, he and I, that we both knew lands of ice and darkness. His had been in the past, mine was in the present. His had been outside himself, mine was within me. Yes, we were brothers, he and I felt closer to him at that moment than to any other human being in all the world. My mother came into the kitchen as we were having supper and sat down at the table. She did not greet us. Mrs. Rackover put a bowl of soup in front of her. My mother said the blessing over bread and began to eat. "Asher," my father said, "eat your soup." Mrs. Rackover moved about quietly. From time to time she glanced at my mother. My mother wore a pink housecoat with lace around the cuffs of the sleeves and along the collar. She had on a pretty blonde wig. She was gaunt, and there were dark circles around her eyes. But the sallowness had begun to leave her face. There were small patches of color in her cheeks. I ate without knowing what I was eating. During the meat course, my father reached for a slice of bread and knocked over his glass of water. Mrs. Rackover wiped up the water without a word and refilled my father's glass. At the end of the meat course, my mother said to me softly, "How are you feeling, Asher?" "I'm fine, Mama." "Are you making new drawings?" "Yes, Mama." I saw a faint smile play on her small lips. "Good drawings, yes, Asher?" "Yes, Mama. I must see them, but not now. Tonight I'm a little tired." She turned to my father, the smile still on her lips. "Arye, what's new in the world?" I saw my father's eyes narrow. He looked away from my mother a moment, then looked back. "A lot," he said softly. "Yes," my mother said, "I'm sure." Then she said, "Arye, is it wrong to leave things unfinished?" It is wrong to leave things unfinished." Slowly, my father rubbed the side of his face. "You taught me that, Arye. It is a victory for the Citra, Atra to leave a task for the Ribono Shell Olam unfinished." "Yes," my father murmured. "I want you to remember that, Arye. Please remember that." My father was quiet. There was a long, strange silence, broken finally by Mrs. Rackover. "Will you have tea, Mrs. Lev?" "Yes, please," my mother said, and smiled faintly. She joined us in the Burchas Hamazon after the meal. She chanted the words very clearly by heart. When we were done, she got to her feet. "I'm a little tired," she said. "Good night, Asher." "Good night, Mama. Tomorrow I will look at your good drawings." My father went with her to their bedroom. "Master of the universe," Mrs. Rackover was murmuring to herself as I walked out of the kitchen. "Master of the universe." I came into my room. I was trembling. "Mama," I thought, "what's happening to you?" I sat at my desk and looked at the drawings of the Russian Jew, the Jew from the land of ice and darkness. I found myself with a crayon in my hand. I could not remember the color of his hair. I began to color the area between the bottom of his cap and the top of his ear. It was a small area. I used a red hue. Now his hair was red. He had dark, nervous eyes and red hair. My fingers were sticky with the wax of the crayons. I did not like the drawing. I went back to my bed. I lay on my bed, not moving, feeling the fear like a presence in the dark places of the room. When I came back to myself from the darkness where I had been, I looked at my window and saw it was night. I went through the hallway into our living room. The room was dark. The window was covered with a Venetian blind. I adjusted the slats and peered between them to the street outside. A stream of headlights moved slowly along the parkway, warm slashes of light in the darkness. After a while, I found it uncomfortable looking between the slats. I started to raise the Venetian blind, pulling hard on the string alongside the window. It was a very tall window, and I got the blind up a few feet over my head when it jammed. I released the string. The left side of the blind dropped about 10 inches. The right side remained in place. I could not move it. I left it that way, a sharp diagonal cutting across the vertical lines of the window. I stood there a long time, looking out at all the cars and the people and the houses of the street. I did not hear my father come into the room. "Asher," he said quietly. "Papa, it's late, Asher. What was Mama saying? What was my mama saying?" "I don't know, Asher. Why is God doing this to our mama?" My father was quiet. Why should God do such a thing? My father turned away from the window and looked at me. I could feel him looking at me. Then he tugged at the cord near the window, and the blind dropped swiftly and with a clattering noise. He flattened the slats and cut out the street and shut out the street. Then he bent over me. I turned and saw him bending over me and felt his hands under my arms, and I was being lifted by him. He held me to him tightly. I put my arms around his neck. I felt his beard on my face. I buried my face into his neck and beard. He carried me to my room. Later, lying in my bed, I said, "Mrs. Rackover told me Reb Udol Krinsky was in Siberia 11 years. Yes. Will you be able to save more Jews from Russia, Papa?" "I don't know. he said wearily. Would you like to travel again, Papa? He looked at me, and his eyes glittered briefly. Yes, he said. Does Reb Krinsky have a wife and children? He had. They died in the war. How did he know about Mama? Everyone knows about your Mama, Asher. Now we'll stop talking and you'll go to sleep. Let me hear your Kriyas Shema. The next morning I went with my father to his office. It rained all morning, a cold, dismal rain that turned the trees black. My father sat at his desk, reading the New York Times. There were few phone calls. Occasionally, he raised his eyes and stared out the window at the rain on the street. His eyes were dark and somber. He seemed very tired. We came home to lunch in the rain. My mother remained in her room. She refused to see me and would not speak to my father when he came in to ask her to join us. The rain continued all afternoon. I wandered about the building, spent a while drying the trees in the rain from the window in my father's office, then stood in the doorway watching the rain fall into the puddles on the flagstone floor of the porch. It was a steady rain, and it fell with soft sounds against the stone and the street. After a while, I watched from inside the rain, and no longer knew I was watching. My father found me like that in the doorway. We walked home together. My mother was asleep. We ate supper alone. It continued to rain. Later, I stood alone at the window of our living room and looked between the slats of the street. The asphalt glittered darkly in the rain. The rain cut through the circles of light around the tops of the lampposts, cold silvery diagonals against the warm yellow-white arcs of brightness. The street seemed to be crying. My father came into the room. It's late, Asher. A few more minutes, Papa, please. He stood beside me. I watched the rain falling against the gleaming blackness of the street. I made a drawing of Reb Krinsky, Papa, but I don't like it. He put his hand on my shoulder. Come to bed now, Asher. The lights came on in the living room. My mother stood in the doorway. The suddenness of the lights in the dark room stung my eyes. My mother had a pale blue bathrobe and slippers. Her short dark hair was uncovered and in disarray. Why do you stand in the dark? She asked softly. My father looked at her for a moment. We were talking, he said. She came slowly into the room, hugging the robe to herself. You slept all day, Rivke, my father said. Are you hungry? I'm not hungry. How are you, Asher? I'm all right, Mama. You look pale. Are they taking care of you? Yes, Mama. You should not let yourself get sick, Asher. Why are we standing? Please, let's sit down. I sat with my father on the sofa. My mother sat facing us on one of the easy chairs. She put her hands on her lap. Wisps of dark hair lay across her forehead, but her eyes seemed clear. I must talk to you, Aryeh, she said quietly. Asher should go to bed. It concerns Asher too. My father was quiet. From somewhere along the parkway came the sound of an automobile horn. Aryeh, my mother said, my brother's work is unfinished. My father looked at her wearily and said nothing. I want to finish my brother's work. My father's mouth slowly fell open. Aryeh, don't deprive me of this. There was urgency in her voice. Please. My father stared at her and said nothing. Aryeh, it's wrong for my brother's work to remain unfinished. I want to complete his work. In September, Asher will enter the yeshiva. Mrs. Rackover will be here when I can't be home. She was silent a moment. Then she said, with a quality in her voice that two people have when they speak an intimate language only they understand, Aryeh, you'll be able to travel again. My father slowly rubbed the side of his face. Please, Aryeh, do you know what it's like for something to be incomplete? My father looked at her and said nothing. Yes, she murmured. You know what it's like. Rivka, we should talk about this another time. Another time? Why another time? Will another time make a difference, Arye? My father was quiet. It's wrong for this also to be incomplete, my mother said. It would be a victory for the Citra Atra. Rivka, you're a mother. There's a child to raise. I'm also a sister and a wife, she said. They looked at each other, and then in silence. After a moment, my mother said, Arye, please let me call the college tomorrow. Wait until Tuesday. Why? I ask you to wait. All right, she said. I'll wait. Then she said, You going to talk to the Reb? Yes. I saw the darkness return suddenly to her eyes. The Reb will never permit me to do it. She pulled the bathrobe tightly to her, as if she were cold. Then her voice became harsh and malevolent. The Reb killed my brother. I stared at her in horror. The blood drained from my father's face. The Reb sent him on a journey, and he was killed. Rivka, please, please, my father murmured. His voice trembled. He said in Yiddish, Master of the universe. My brother would not have been killed if the Reb had not told him to travel. Enough, my father said, getting to his feet. Asher, come with me. We'll talk more later, Rivka. But his work shouldn't be incomplete. The Citra Atra would love his work to remain incomplete. Explain that to the Reb, Arye. Asher, come with me. Do you hear? Yes, by all means, put the boy to bed. Look how pale he is. Is he getting his vitamins? Do you get your vitamins, Asher? I think I'll go to bed now, too. I'm very tired. She rose abruptly to her feet, hugging the robe tightly to her small body. Good night. Please, Arye, please, explain it to the Reb. She went quickly from the room. My father stood near his chair and stared down at the floor. He kept rubbing the side of his face. Papa? He went on rubbing his face and staring at the floor. Papa? Will Mama go to school and not be home? He did not respond. Papa, I'm very scared. Papa. He held me to him then, tightly. My face was against his beard. I had my eyes wide open, and I saw the skin of his face and the red strands of individual hairs and the pink corners of his eyes. He smelled of warmth. An odor of strength and warmth came from him. He carried me to my room and helped me get into my pajamas. He sat on the edge of my bed. I said to him, How could Mama say those things about the Reb? My father said nothing. He looked tormented. Then, abruptly, he got to his feet, said good night, and went from the room. He had forgotten to ask me to say the Kriya Shema. I remember that night very clearly, the texture of its darkness, the echoing resonance of its sounds. I lay in my bed in the enveloping night and felt myself one with all the vast and endless arc of the universe, felt myself as raw flesh connected to near and distant pain. The Reb killed my brother, I heard my mother say, and it was as if the words came hurtling through the black face of the universe, searing words, demonic words, from the Citra Atra, the other side, from the region of blackness that spawned horror and evil, and the stone held that that enclosed the light. Sometime in the night, I came out of my bedroom and went through the hallway to the window of the living room. The rain had stopped. A huge 3/4 moon hung in the clear sky and cast a bluish light across the buildings and the parkway below. The night was still. The sky was a tranquil counterpoint to private fears. I returned to my room. There was the drawing of the Russian Jew, barely visible on my desk. I looked at it, and for a long moment felt it as a wedge into the darkness, a light encasing the shell. Uncle Yitzchok had liked one of my drawings. I would work again on the drawing of the Russian Jew. I would learn to draw my feelings of ice and darkness and street crying, and a street crying, "There is nothing I cannot do." Then I was back in my bed and the darkness returned, and with it the memories and horror of the night. To draw, to make lines and shapes on pieces of paper, was a futile indulgence in the face of such immutable darkness, a foolishness I would certainly leave behind when I entered the world beyond the window of our living room. Yes, my uncle had a strange sense of humor. The Russian Jew would remain unfinished, the land of ice and darkness, the street crying in the rain. All of it would remain the fantasy of a child. I would grow up. I lay in my bed in the darkness of the night, praying to grow up. The Reb gave his permission. That September, I entered the Ladover Yeshiva. My mother entered Brooklyn College, and my father resumed his journeys for the Reb. I had stopped drawing.